Hello, and welcome to iNet. Coming up on the program, another Nakba. Israel responds to Hamas attacks with fire and fury, killing tens of thousands of civilians in the process. Trench warfare, the front lines in the Russia-Ukraine war stagnate as soldiers are left fighting in trenches straight out of World War I. World on fire. El Nino combined with long-term climate change creates the hottest year on record, causing wildfires around the world to burn out of control. Rise of the machines. As generative AI technology moves into the mainstream, concerns are raised over fake news and misinformation and loss of jobs. This is the world this year, 2023. October the 7th, 2023 is a date that will live in infamy for Israel after Hamas terrorists launched an unprecedented attack on Israeli civilians and soldiers. The assault claimed the lives of over 1,200 people and led to the taking of hostages. In response, Israel initiated a series of airstrikes on the Gaza Strip and imposed a blockade, severing vital supply lines for food, water, and medicine. The situation further intensified following Israel's ground invasion on October 27th, which prompted the evacuation of northern Gaza, causing the displacement of over 1 million people. Throughout the conflict, Israel has been accused of war crimes, including the deliberate targeting of hospitals and civilians. Israel's defense, asserting that those targeted were Hamas militants, lacked concrete evidence and added fuel to the international condemnation. The repercussions of the conflict spilled beyond the region, manifesting in heightened tensions worldwide. Hate crimes around the world surged against both Muslims and Jews, with notable incidents such as the shooting of a Palestinian man in Vermont and mobs attacking an Israeli plane landing in Russia. Hundreds of thousands of people marched in solidarity with Palestinian civilians in Western countries, expressing their concerns about the humanitarian toll. Amidst the grim narrative, a brief ceasefire during the week of November 24th offered a temporary reprieve, allowing limited aid to flow into Gaza and some hostages to be released. However, negotiations to extend the ceasefire failed and fighting quickly resumed. The toll of this escalation has been devastating, with more than 20,000 people killed on the Palestinian side and hundreds of Israeli soldiers dying during the fighting. For Palestinians who have survived the Israeli onslaught, life has become a hell on earth, with few operational hospitals, no consistent access to clean water or food, constant forced migrations between so-called safe zones, and the ever-present threat of attack. While Israel enjoyed significant international support early on in the conflict, that support has eroded as the death toll mounted. In December, the United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly in support of a motion calling for a ceasefire, with just 10 countries voting against it. International and domestic support for the war effort took another blow on December 16th, after it was revealed that Israeli soldiers executed 3 Israeli hostages after misidentifying them as Hamas militants. The United States continues to be a staunch ally of Israel, supporting their war effort with billions of dollars in aid, though, as the civilian death toll increases, even they may be forced to take a harsher stance on the conflict. While there were initial fears of fighting spilling beyond Gaza, the military response from other Arab countries has largely been muted. There has been an escalation of tensions along Israel's border with Lebanon, but overall no major escalations. Shipping, however, in the Red Sea has been periodically disrupted as Houthi rebels in Yemen have launched drone attacks against ships they perceive as having ties to Israel. The Red Sea, of course, is one of the world's busiest shipping routes, and it remains to be seen what the long-term economic impact may be. Even before the October the 7th escalations, 2023 had witnessed a distressing escalation of tensions between Israel and Palestine. On the night of February 26th, Israeli settlers went on a rampage, burning homes in the West Bank and leaving more than 100 injured. This act of violence followed an incident in which a Palestinian gunman killed 2 Israelis in their car in the West Bank. Tensions flared further in East Jerusalem when a gunman responded to an Israeli military aid by killing 7 civilians. Israel's response to the shooting took the form of collective punishment against the shooter's family, with as many as 50 family members being arrested and the family home being demolished. In March and April, the situation escalated further as Hamas fired rockets into Israel, prompting Israeli airstrikes on Gaza and southern Lebanon. And the conflict reached a critical point when the Israeli police raided the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, killing 50 people and arresting 400. Outside of the Palestinian conflict, Israel also experienced some of its most significant domestic political unrest after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu attempted to overhaul the way judges were selected for the Supreme Court. The move was a clear attempt by Netanyahu to manipulate the court's decision-making related to his own political corruption trials. Citizens took to the streets by the tens of thousands to protest the move, and many members of the military even refused to show up for service. Following the October the 7th attacks, however, Netanyahu has shelved the judicial overhaul, and the demonstrations have largely subsided. Turning now to Europe, and Russia's invasion of the Ukraine continued throughout the year when both sides engaged in heavy fighting in eastern Ukraine. In January, the Russians, supported by Wagner mercenaries, managed to storm the eastern city of Soledar, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of soldiers on both sides of the conflict. Following the fall of Soledar, fighting would center around the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut, which unfolded as a brutal and devastating conflict, resulting in tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. The fighting began with Russia gaining initial control of the region in March. However, Ukraine mounted a fierce counteroffensive in May. The battle for Bakhmut quickly earned a grim reputation, with observers describing it as a vortex and a meat grinder, emphasizing the sheer magnitude of the human cost, emerging as one of the bloodiest engagements of the 21st century. Another major event in the conflict was the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam in southeast Ukraine. At around 2 a.m. on the 6th of June, several explosions in the vicinity of the dam were reported by both Russians and Ukrainians. And while there is no direct evidence, it is assumed that Russian forces blew up the dam in order to slow a planned Ukrainian counteroffensive. The destruction of the dam created one of the worst environmental catastrophes of the conflict, flooding hundreds of square kilometers and displacing thousands of people. Throughout the war, Russia has relied heavily on the Wagner mercenary group. Yet, throughout the conflict, Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin has been highly critical of the Kremlin, often complaining that his soldiers were not being treated fairly and were undersupplied. On June 24th, Prigozhin led an armed uprising against the Russian military after he claimed Russia had killed a number of Wagner fighters in an airstrike. The world watched as Prigozhin's forces marched towards Moscow, encountering little resistance from the Russian military. By the next day, though, the rebellion had come to a sudden, unexpected end, after Prigozhin accepted an immunity deal for him and his troops. Prigozhin was then exiled to Belarus and was conveniently killed in a subsequent plane crash in August. Wagner continues to be an important asset for the Russians. However, since the death of Prigozhin, they have been folded into the military. Ukraine has relied heavily on financial and military support from Western powers. However, as the conflict drags on, war fatigue has been driving waning public support across Western nations. The United States in particular has been bleeding support for Ukraine, with Republicans blocking further funding of the war until the new year. While the front lines have been largely stagnant over the past year, the withdrawal of U.S. support could very well see a Russian annexation of large swathes of Ukrainian territory. Turning now to the climate crisis, and in March, the United Nations issued one of the most dire warnings yet, saying the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is nearly unattainable. This warning came against the backdrop of a massive number of extreme weather events in 2023. In March, California experienced devastating floods triggered by multiple atmospheric rivers and heavy rain, resulting in 22 fatalities and causing more than $4.6 billion in damages. The following month, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, faced flash floods, adding to the toll of extreme weather events in the United States. Canada bore witness to its worst wildfire season on record, with historic blazes ravaging Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Ontario. The resulting smoke from the Canadian wildfires blanketed cities across the eastern U.S., creating hazardous conditions for residents. British Columbia and Alberta grappled with severe drought conditions, fueling hundreds of fires that burned through hundreds of thousands of hectares. Like with the fires in central Canada, the impact of these fires contributed to a global rise in air pollution. Italy experienced rivers overflowing, leading to widespread flooding that claimed the lives of 17 people and caused over 10 billion euros in damages. Meanwhile, Cyclone Biparjoy struck Pakistan, displacing thousands and causing more than $100 million in damages. In Libya, as many as 5,000 people were killed when intense tropical storms led to dams near the city of Derna collapsing. The collapse of the dams sent a wall of water and mud crashing into the city. El Niño, combined with broader climate change trends, contributed to the highest global temperature ever recorded, and nowhere was this more evident than when extreme heat waves gripped the northern hemisphere. The heat waves shattered temperature records and led to the tragic loss of tens of thousands of lives. In South Korea, flash floods caused flooding that claimed 47 lives, while Greece saw over 20,000 people displaced due to wildfires burning through 1.8 million square kilometers. Nova Scotia, already grappling with historic wildfires in May, suffered further devastation when record-breaking flooding in July hit the region. China experienced hundreds of landslides in August when unrelenting rains pounded the country. And in a rare occurrence, the entire Canadian city of Yellowknife was evacuated due to wildfires in the Northwest Territories in August. And a series of wildfires wiped out the entire Hawaiian city of Lahaina, claiming more than 100 lives. On the other end of the spectrum, extreme cold weather gripped the eastern U.S. near the beginning of the year, setting record-breaking temperature lows along the coast, and Hurricane Idalia struck the coast of Florida, resulting in $3.6 billion in damages. Scientists warn that the plethora of extreme weather events in 2023 is just a taste of the severe weather the world will face should global warming continue on its current trajectory. The political situation in the United States remains unpredictable, with the U.S. House of Representatives failing to elect a speaker in January. Following the previous year's midterm elections, control over the House had shifted to the Republican Party, which necessitated the election of a new speaker. Infighting within the party left no general consensus on who should run the House, leaving it paralyzed until January 7th, when Kevin McCarthy was finally elected after 15 ballots. Infighting within the Republican Party was a common theme throughout the year, and it eventually bubbled over when Donald Trump supporters ousted the somewhat moderate McCarthy in October, once again leaving the speakership vacant. After nearly 10 days and more than 4 rounds of voting, the House would eventually elect Mike Johnson as the new speaker. Johnson is known for being a staunch Trump supporter and denier of the 2020 election. The election of Johnson to the speaker's role underscores dramatic changes in the Republican Party towards ultra-conservative and neo-fascist ideologies. In April, Fox News reached a $787 million settlement with Dominion Voting Systems in a defamation case surrounding the 2020 presidential election. Dominion was suing Fox News for broadcasting lies and misinformation, claiming that the election had been rigged. Ahead of the trial, internal Fox communications were released that showed that even though no one at the network actually believed the election had been rigged, repeating the claims made business sense and made the network a hell of a lot of money. Fox News faces a separate legal battle with Smartmatic, a different voting machine company. Donald Trump's misdeeds are finally catching up with him after he was criminally indicted in 4 separate states. Trump's indictments include falsifying business records, mishandling sensitive documents, and conspiring to overturn the 2020 election. Trump has falsely claimed, without evidence, that the indictments are an attempt to stop him from running in the 2024 elections. Rudy Giuliani, who was the personal attorney to Donald Trump, was ordered in December to pay nearly $150 million to 2 election workers in Georgia after they were harassed and intimidated following Giuliani's repetition of Donald Trump's lies following the 2020 election. In response, Giuliani has declared bankruptcy. 4 members of the Proud Boys were handed lengthy prison sentences for their role in the attempted insurrection of Capitol Hill in January 2021. The group is a militant organization which pushes far-right conspiracy theories and has aligned themselves with Donald Trump. And the final saga of the Trump story, at least for 2023, came in December when the Colorado Supreme Court voted to remove Trump from the ballot for the 2024 Republican primaries. The court cited a civil-era law which prohibited individuals involved in an insurrection from running for office. The case is likely to be brought to the U.S. Supreme Court in the new year. The increasingly unstable political situation in the United States and the proliferation of the lie that the 2020 election was rigged is due in no small part to lies and misinformation being pushed by ultra-conservative broadcasters and social media. In 2022, Elon Musk finalized a deal to take control over social media giant Twitter, and in 2023, we all got to witness firsthand Musk's colossal mismanagement of the platform. When Musk took over, Twitter's valuation was over $40 billion, and by October, its estimated value had plummeted to just $19 billion. Twitter, under Musk, has been bleeding users and advertisers, both of whom have been leaving the platform in droves due to a massive increase in racism, disinformation, anti-Semitism, and censorship of other platforms. Musk has also faced criticism for doing away with verified accounts, replacing them with a paid tier, as well as blocking access to third-party apps and services. Despite the launch of a number of competitors, including Blue Sky, Threads, and the open-source Mastodon, none have emerged to enjoy the dominance that Twitter once did, leading to fragmentation of the space. The dumpster fire that is Twitter is a great reminder of the increasingly significant role social media plays in our everyday lives. Around the world, more people are using social media as their primary and increasingly only source of news, something that is cannibalizing the revenue streams of legitimate news organizations. Several countries have tried to pass laws forcing social media giants to pay news publishers for content shared on their platforms, and in Canada, Bill C-18 was passed as an attempt to codify into law a payment scheme between social media companies and news organizations. In response to the law, Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram, blocked users in Canada from sharing news articles, something which caused much distress among wildfire evacuees in the summer. By contrast to Meta, Google announced in November that they had reached a deal with publishers to pay for news content shared on Google platforms. In late 2022, the company OpenAI launched a chatbot based on a large language model called ChatGPT. The application quickly became one of the fastest growing software applications in history, gaining over 100 million users in short order. The utility of ChatGPT cannot be understated. It is capable of writing computer code, composing essays, and even assisting in the writing of a year in review script. However, it's not without its problems. While ChatGPT is great at putting together authoritative-sounding sentences, the resulting content needs to be fact-checked and reviewed, since a lot of what it says has revealed to be total fabrication. The popularity of generative AI in general, including ChatGPT and others, has led to concerns about how it could be leveraged by bad actors to create fake news and misinformation, particularly in light of some upcoming high-profile elections. In May, Dr. Jeffrey Hinton resigned from Google and expressed concern and regret about his role in the rise of artificial intelligence. And later that same month, the CEO of ChatGPT himself said that AI needed to be regulated. In November, Britain hosted the world's first ever AI safety summit to try and kickstart a conversation on what regulatory frameworks could look like. The success of ChatGPT notwithstanding, November was a particularly rocky month for OpenAI after its board of directors fired Sam Altman suddenly and with vague reasoning. In response, nearly all of the staff of OpenAI threatened to resign, leading to the reinstatement of Altman and the resignation of nearly the entire OpenAI board. In April, fighting broke out between Sudan's military and the paramilitary force, the Rapid Support Forces. Initial fighting broke out at the presidential palace and army headquarters, but quickly spread to other cities across the country. In response to the ongoing battles, many Western nations opted to evacuate and close down their embassies. The ongoing conflict has claimed the lives of more than 9,000 people and caused the displacement of nearly 5 million civilians. In July, the balance of power in Central Africa was upset after the presidential guard detained Mohamed Bazoum, president of Niger. Bazoum has refused to step down and has received vocal support from France as well as ECOWAS, which is a regional African body. Following the coup, demonstrators have taken to the streets in support of the military, demanding the resignation of the president and the removal of all French troops from the country. Tensions escalated over the course of July and August, with ECOWAS threatening a military invasion of the country, while the junta threatened to assassinate the former president in retaliation. Ultimately, though, the situation would be resolved relatively peacefully, with France announcing at least a partial withdrawal of its military presence from the country. The situation in Niger follows coups in Gabon, Burkina Faso, and other Central African countries, overthrowing democratically elected governments who are generally friendly towards Western powers. The result is a shift in power from Western-aligned governments to military-backed dictatorships, many of them supported by Russia's Wagner mercenaries. Former Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan was arrested on May 9th, sparking protests and riots across the country. In response to the ongoing unrest, the Pakistani government issued a nearly total ban on the internet and mobile broadband. Khan was released days later, but was then rearrested a second time in August. He is currently in prison awaiting trial. Pakistan also suffered 2 unrelated acts of violence in the form of suicide bombings. The first incident took place in January when members of the Pakistani Taliban blew themselves up at a mosque. The next incident took place at a political convention in July. It left 44 people dead and a further 120 injured. On September 19th, Azerbaijan launched a military offensive into the Armenian-controlled Nagorno-Karabakh region. The military portion would be short-lived, and a ceasefire was agreed just one day later. Following the ceasefire, though, the majority Armenian population in the region fled, fearing mistreatment and reprisals by the Azerbaijanis. In just over a week, 100,000 people fled the region, leaving it nearly deserted, and Azerbaijan has now assumed full control over the territory. Police in Georgia used water cannon and tear gas against protesters who took to the streets in March. Protesters were demonstrating against a proposed foreign influence law, and if passed, that law would have forced any agency that received more than 20% of its funding from abroad as a foreign agent. The law was eventually scrapped by the government following the protests. 2023 in the United States was marred by a series of mass shootings highlighting the ongoing issue of gun violence in that country. In Louisville, Kentucky, a shooting at a bank claimed the lives of 5 individuals. In May, a mall in Allen, Texas became the scene of another tragedy where 8 people lost their lives. A particularly distressing incident unfolded elsewhere in Texas after a deranged neighbor, angered by a request to be quiet, carried out a horrifying attack, shooting an entire family. 5 people were killed in that incident, and the survivors are traumatized. Monterey Park, California witnessed a tragic mass shooting that resulted in the deaths of 11 individuals occurring in the aftermath of a Lunar New Year party. And shockingly, less than 24 hours later, another mass shooting unfolded in a rural California town, claiming the lives of 7 more people. A school in Nashville became the scene of yet another mass shooting, resulting in the deaths of 6 individuals, and the city of Lewiston experienced a particularly devastating spree of violence, with 18 people losing their lives in 3 separate incidents. A gunman went on a rampage, leaving communities in shock and prompting a manhunt that would last 2 days. Outside of the United States, there was more tragedy. 6 people were killed in Hamburg, Germany, after a shooter opened fire at a Jehovah's Witnesses hall. The perpetrator, who was also killed in the attack, was motivated by anger against the religious group. A rare mass shooting took place in the Czech capital of Prague on December 21st. A gunman opened fire on the campus of Charles University just after 3 p.m. local time, killing 14 and injuring 25. The gunman was killed in the police response. Shootings in New Zealand are rare, but on July 20th, 2 people were killed and 10 injured on a construction site after a 24-year-old employee opened fire. France experienced 4 months of civil unrest beginning in January after mass protests broke out across the country. The protesters were demonstrating against pension reforms pushed through by President Emmanuel Macron. Macron's pensions reforms were primarily centered around raising the retirement age to 64, up from 62. Protesters took to the streets en masse and created months of disruption, including a shutdown of public transportation and garbage piling up on the streets. Ultimately, though, the pension reforms were passed after Macron's government survived 2 no-confidence motions. And in July, thousands of French citizens would again take to the streets. This time they were protesting against the police shooting of a teenager at a traffic stop in the town of Nanterre. The protests would devolve into rioting and looting, which lasted for some 19 days and caused 650 million euros in damages. On January 7th, Tyree Nichols was killed after having an altercation with 5 police officers in Memphis, Tennessee. The death of Tyree was just the latest in a series of police killings in the United States the previous year, which had bubbled over into protests and riots across the country. Tyree's killing this year also sparked protests across the U.S., but none of the violence seen the previous year. Tensions between China and Taiwan peaked in August, with Chinese warplanes regularly encroaching on Taiwanese airspace and its boats making regular incursions across the Taiwanese Strait. The heightened military activity followed a meeting between Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen and then U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy in California. 2023 was a rough year for the banking sector after Silicon Valley Bank collapsed on March 10th. The collapse of SVB is the 3rd largest U.S. banking collapse in history, and it happened after customers, driven by rumors on social media, withdrew more than $40 billion in a matter of days. The collapse of Silicon Valley Bank sent shockwaves through the banking industry and laid the groundwork for the collapse of a second major financial institution, First Republic Bank, in May. First Republic collapsed after its stock price entered a free fall following a downgrade of its credit rating. And in Europe, Switzerland's Credit Suisse nearly failed and was eventually bought by competitor UBS after its stock prices fell following a run on the institution. On April 13, 2023, dozens of FBI agents descended on a home in small-town Massachusetts and arrested Jack Teixeira under the Espionage Act. Texeria was responsible for obtaining and leaking classified information from the US military to a Discord server, where it was then spread to various channels online. The Pentagon leaks created a bit of a diplomatic crisis between the US and drove a wedge between it and its Five Eyes allies. In May, Uganda passed some of the most draconian anti-LGBT laws in the world after the president signed into law the so-called Anti-Homosexuality Act. Under the act, anyone convicted of having same-sex relation faces 10 years in prison, and anyone convicted of so-called aggravated homosexuality faces the death penalty. Human rights groups have rightfully condemned the legislation, and relations between Uganda and Western countries has suffered as a result. Tensions between Sweden and Turkey soured after Sweden, along with Finland, applied to join NATO following Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. Turkey opposed Sweden's membership, accusing them of supporting groups such as the PKK, which Turkey considers a terrorist organization. In response, protesters in Sweden took to the streets and even burned copies of the Quran, angering Muslims worldwide. In July, Sweden agreed to supply Turkey with a detailed plan on how they would fight terrorism, and Turkey agreed to ratify their accession to NATO. That ratification, however, has still not occurred. In Kenya, the bodies of more than 400 people were uncovered following the police investigation of a doomsday cult led by Paul Mackenzie. Mackenzie allegedly encouraged his followers to starve themselves to death in order to meet Jesus Christ. He has been incarcerated pending trial. On June 14th, a former fishing boat used to smuggle illegal migrants sank off the coast of Greece. The boat was carrying more than 600 people, but only 104 people were rescued, the rest either confirmed dead or presumed dead. The June disaster followed a similar incident in February when 94 people drowned after a migrant boat sank in harsh weather off the coast of Italy. Whilst illegal migration into Europe peaked in 2015, every year tens of thousands of people still try to make their way to the continent in search of better lives. Many voyages ending in tragedy just like these. In June, 5 people were killed after the Titan submersible imploded at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean while on an expedition to view the wreck of the Titanic. On June 18th, just 90 minutes after it began its descent, the submersible stopped communicating with its support vessel, causing alarm. What followed was a massive search and rescue operation involving more than half a dozen agencies. Ultimately, though, after 4 days of searching, the wreck of the sub was discovered, and investigators determined that it likely imploded soon after it began its descent. In a scene eerily similar to the attempted insurrection of the United States Congress back in 2021, a mob of right-wing supporters of defeated former President Jair Bolsonaro stormed the Brazilian Congress, seeking to overthrow the democratically elected Lula da Silva. The mob caused widespread damage to several federal buildings, but were ultimately stopped by security forces. One of the deadliest earthquakes in recorded history happened early in the morning of February 6th, when a magnitude 7.8 quake ripped through large swathes of Syria and Turkey. The effects of the quake were exacerbated by poor construction standards, which caused entire neighborhoods in the countries to crumble. Immediately following the disaster, dozens of aid agencies responded, and although tens of thousands of people were rescued, the quake claimed the lives of more than 50,000 people. More than 1,400 people were killed in the Afghan province of Herat after a series of earthquakes tore through the region in October. Rescue efforts were hampered by the fact that international support for Afghanistan had waned following the seizure of power by the Taliban the previous year. A magnitude 6.8 quake struck in the late evening near the city of Marrakesh in Morocco, killing a staggering 2,900 people. The quake occurred at a depth of 18 kilometers and injured a further 5,000 people. 153 people were killed and 375 injured when a magnitude 5.7 earthquake struck western Nepal in November. The quake is the deadliest to strike the country since 2015. On February 28th, 2 trains collided head-on, leading to the deaths of more than 50 people and injuring 85. The crash happened in the Tempe Valley region in Greece and became the deadliest rail disaster in Greek history. Following the crash, demonstrators took to the streets to protest declining rail standards in the country. And nearly 300 people were killed in India in the state of Odisha after 3 passenger trains collided following a signaling failure. The incident is the world's deadliest train crash since 2004. A train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, spilled over 100,000 gallons of hazardous materials into the environment and sparked a fire which burned for days. The derailment forced the evacuation of all residents within a 1-mile radius and necessitated emergency response from more than 70 agencies. While residents were allowed to return to their homes on February 9th, many have insisted that they have suffered health problems long after the evacuation order was lifted. On January 5th, a wave of violence swept across the Sinaloa region of Mexico as cartel gangsters blocked roads and attacked military checkpoints. They were doing so in protest of the detention of one of their leaders. 30 people were killed on both sides of the conflict, and the Culiacan airport was closed for a time, stranding passengers. At the end of 2022, following a series of protests, China relaxed nearly all of their COVID-19 restrictions, leading to a surge in cases following the start of the new year. In the first few weeks of January, more than 120,000 new patients were admitted to hospitals in China with the virus. Following the surge in cases, China's numbers have been brought back in line with most of the rest of the world. In early February, residents of the United States became fascinated with what their government described as a Chinese spy balloon hovering over sensitive military sites in the U.S. The balloon was first detected on January 28th and quickly gained notoriety in U.S. media. The balloon was shot down by the military on February 4th after blowing over the Atlantic Ocean. Thousands of flights across the United States were grounded on January 11th after a glitch in the FAA's Notice to Airmen computer system caused a complete failure. The shutdown lasted just over an hour, but the cascading impact of failures could be felt for days. Like in 2022, inflation made headlines throughout the year. While interest rate hikes throughout the previous year has had some effect, the rising cost of goods, particularly food, has hit many people hard and has led to the largest increase in food bank usage in generations. 2023 saw a fair amount of labor unrest as the rising cost of living prompted unions to call for higher wages around the world. In April, 100,000 passengers in Germany had their planes disrupted after airport workers walked off the job. Here in British Columbia, the port of Vancouver was shut down for 12 days when workers went on strike. And in October, more than 100 ships were disrupted along the St. Lawrence Seaway after marine workers there voted to strike. Relations between Canada and India reached one of the lowest points in recent history after Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced in September that Canadian authorities had credible evidence that India's ultra-nationalist government was involved in the assassination of a prominent Sikh separatist in Surrey, BC. The Indian government denied the allegations and instituted a sort of diplomatic war with Canada, suspending visa services and even ordering Canadian officials to leave India. In November, though, the FBI announced that they were also investigating the Indian government with their involvement in 3 separate assassination plots. This forced Indian officials to strike a more conciliatory tone and resume diplomatic relations with Canada. Staying in Canada and allegations of election interference in this country's political system sparked a small political crisis. Media reports alleged that the Chinese government had funneled money to specific candidates in the 2019 and 2021 elections. Following the news, Canada's opposition parties united in calls for a public inquiry on the subject, nearly bringing down the government. An inquiry into the matter, though, has been scheduled for the new year. The Supreme Court is arguably the most influential yet unelected body in the United States. Its decisions affect generations of Americans far beyond the cycle of an election. Over the past few years, the court has been criticized for falling out of step with mainstream American society and taking a sharp turn to the right. Decisions, such as the one which overturned universal access to abortion last year, have had far-reaching consequences for millions of Americans. And in 2023, the court made another controversial decision, which could have an impact on LGBT rights for years to come. In the case, the court ruled that a Colorado-based web designer had the right to refuse work brought to her from same-sex couples on account of her extremist religious beliefs. The ruling effectively overturned Colorado's anti-discrimination law and could have implications for other anti-discrimination cases across the United States. In a surprise result, the so-called Freedom Party won the largest number of seats in the 2023 Dutch parliamentary elections. The party, run by the extremist Geert Wilders, is a far-right party which has been quick to embrace conspiracy theories, xenophobia, and Euroscepticism. While the party claimed the largest number of seats in the election, they did fall short of a majority, necessitating the formation of a coalition government. Contaminated meatloaf is described as the likely cause of an E. coli outbreak at daycares in the city of Calgary in September. The outbreak caused more than 350 cases of the virus in children at different facilities across the city, many of them resulting in hospitalizations. The food preparation company responsible has had its business license revoked. Travel between Canada and the US was disrupted in November after a car exploded at the Niagara Falls border crossing in Ontario. The car, which was traveling at a high rate of speed, crashed into a row of security booths before exploding. It killed the two occupants of the vehicle. Terrorism is not suspected in the incident. Pope Benedict XVI made headlines in 2013 after he became the first pope to resign in more than 600 years. On December 31st, 2022, he passed away. Benedict XVI was 95 years old. Henry Kissinger, former U.S. Secretary of State, who, among other achievements, is credited with helping to end the Vietnam War, died on November 29th. Kissinger was 100 years old. And in a scene reminiscent of the 2010 Chilean mine rescue, 41 workers were rescued from a collapsed tunnel in India. The workers were trapped for 17 days when the transportation tunnel they were building collapsed. Rescuers frantically worked to drill a 1-meter tunnel, which was used to pull the miners to safety. All 41 people were ultimately rescued from the site. Spectacular sights danced across television screens around the world after Iceland's Sundunkur volcano erupted in December. The eruption followed weeks of seismic activity in the region, which caused sinkholes to open up and prompted the evacuation of the entire town of Grindavik, as well as the popular Blue Lagoon spa. There is no doubt that 2023 has been a rough year for a lot of people. A fresh crisis has erupted in the Middle East. Russia's invasion of the Ukraine has continued with no end in sight, and instability in Africa has accelerated, with coups more common than elections. Closer to home, the rise of AI has led to uncertainty about jobs and misinformation. Inflation is making everything unaffordable, and extreme weather has wreaked havoc around the world. People, though, are resilient. And despite the challenges, many are already looking forward to what we all hope will be a better 2024. From all of us here at iNet, thanks for watching, stay safe, and we'll see you in the new year.